Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone around the world. Thanks for joining us for today's panel discussion titled Developers versus Executives on Overcoming Cloud-Native Roadblocks. My name is Brian Foster, Content Director at Lightbend, and I'll be your MC and guide throughout today's event. How and why do enterprises adopt cloud-native technologies? To better understand this question, Lightbend recently released its third annual survey analysis that paints a picture of enterprises in the midst of rapid technological change and faced with big questions about their futures. This survey of over 1,000 developers, architects, and IT executives reveals that companies encounter many roadblocks when migrating to a cloud-native architecture. The biggest being aligning management priorities with developer technologies. We've put together today's panel to shed more light on these roadblocks. We'll kick things off with a brief overview of key findings from the survey, after which we'll transition into the panel discussion, where each panelist will answer a series of questions from both an executive and developer perspective. We'll leave some time at the end to answer any questions that come in via the chat window. And we encourage all attendees to submit their questions as soon as they can. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Joining us today is Clint Finley, ex-Wired journalist and survey report author. Clint will offer up executive insights from over a dozen IT leaders he interviewed for Lightbend survey. Welcome, Clint.
Thanks for having me.
In addition, Duncan DeVore, principal engineer at Brighthouse Financial and Lightbend alum, is here with us and will highlight some different priorities from a developer perspective based on his 20+ years in the industry. Welcome, Duncan.
Thanks a lot. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you both on today's panel discussion. So let's dive in. Clint, I'd like to get started with you. Can you share some highlights of the findings you gathered for the survey report?
Sure. So one big thing is that there's still a lot of confusion about what cloud native really means. And interestingly, this actually really surprised me. I think executives had a firmer understanding of what the most important aspects of going cloud native actually are than developers, where developers were a lot more focused on specific technologies, containers and things like that, where executives were thinking more along the lines of how does this fit into a business strategy and how do we make our applications actually take advantage of the cloud infrastructure, regardless of whether that's Amazon or whether it's Azure or whether it's a private cloud service. Even in that case, in a lot of cases, executives that we talked to, even if they sort of understood intuitively what cloud native meant, it wasn't necessarily a term that they were exceedingly familiar with. And the survey data kind of bore that out in that the developers in their responses were saying the most important thing is things like containers or K8s and things like that, as opposed to the strategy, whereas the executive responses were saying it's more about taking advantage of the cloud infrastructure.
Gotcha. And so diving just a little bit deeper into that, what were some particular findings that came out of the survey?
Sorry, I gotta pull that up. I had prepped some stuff, but it was a little different. So you're asking like some of the specific statistics that from the survey?
Statistics, or even just some of those high-level findings.
Right. Well, sorry, it's been a little while since I've looked at this. Can we maybe skip that and come back to it in a second?
Sure. Yeah. No, that sounds
if you have
perfect.
anything for Duncan, yeah.
Well, I think now is a good time to really, what we can do is we can actually jump into the discussion. And again, I think, there's a lot of good things that we'll learn from that. And again, moving into the discussion, how it's going to be working is I'll ask a series of questions for each of you, with the idea being that we'll receive an executive perspective from you, Clint, and then Duncan, you'll be able to share some developer insights from your experience. So yeah, Duncan, I'd love to start with you, and I'd love to ask, in your perspective, how can organizations ensure success when going cloud native?
So a lot of it has to do with the culture and the philosophy of the organization. At an extremely high level, we've heard this said many times before, that companies need to, at least in part, start to look at themselves as software companies, because the software infrastructure is becoming so critical to their processes and all the things that they're doing as a business. Now, depending on the business itself and what vertical it's in, can, like a more mature business, it's probably not the right word, but like a financial industries business or something like that, that's been around forever, they're a little bit more cast in the way they view things. And so it takes, a cheerleader from the inside to kind of embrace that notion of what the cloud is and how to process it. So we have this whole social or philosophical aspect that is a hurdle. And there's two ways to do it. One is to know the right people, get in there, convince the executives. And another way is to kind of break it off as a bubble and let it prove itself. And then once they see the success or the value of it that way, then they can have they're generally a little bit more acceptable in moving in that direction, because it's an unknown to them. They don't understand it. It's just this unknown thing, and it costs lots of money. So yeah, it's understandable.
Yeah, and further to that, would you say developers, when they hear cloud native, or when they just think about the cloud, are they excited about this new world, or do they think, oh no, here's another new thing that we have to kind of gear up for?
Yeah, I would say that some are, and some are, they don't know whether to be excited or not, just because it's a big unknown. You got to understand, a lot of the people that came up that are executives now, even if they have an IT background, came up in a more monolithic time, right? When they were learning how to code, they were probably doing C or something like that, Fortran, who knows. And now they're in this new environment, and if they don't stay up on the technology, you'll get lost really quick. And it's difficult to do that as an executive, right? Continue to write code and stay up with all the latest, because there's so many other things that you're responsible for. But I would say in general, they have a sense that this is the direction that companies need to go, or their company needs to go. They're just a little weary.
That makes sense. Yeah, and Clint, I'd love to turn to you with that same question. How, from what you learned from the survey and the interviews you conducted, what did you see, in terms of leaders? How can organizations ensure success when going cloud native?
Right. Well, the thing that I heard again and again from executives is that they need to keep the big picture in mind, because going cloud native isn't just a matter of lifting and shifting applications into virtual machines to run in the cloud on cloud infrastructure. They really are thinking more about how do we re-architect these applications to actually take advantage of cloud infrastructure. Because there are advantages and disadvantages to a cloud infrastructure, and an application needs to be built with those in mind. So obvious advantages, elasticity and scalability. So are you building applications with that they can automatically scale? If not, then kind of what are you doing in the cloud? And then on the flip side of that, if you're dealing with cloud environments where there's going to be a lot of latency, where function as a service is one that has a reputation for that, whether fairly or not. So how are you addressing that, the potential for network outages and for communication to be potentially dropped between different components of a system? Those are all things that you need to take into account that weren't necessarily something that in an older legacy environment needed to really be thought about a lot. And so with that in mind, there's a real need to make sure that there's funding for not just buying subscriptions to public cloud accounts, but actually re-architecting those applications and allocating resources towards that. In some cases, organizations are going to have to bring in outside help if they don't have the in-house expertise to do that. So they need to make sure that's in the budget, that they're assigning people to those tasks with that in mind. That this is not just a matter of just throwing something onto the cloud. And I mean, beyond that, just the need to really understand that technology isn't magic, that it doesn't just you're not just going to automatically solve a bunch of business problems by re-architecting them for the cloud. There needs to be some thought put into what specifically you're trying to accomplish. If your goal is just cost savings, that's going to look very different from a goal where what you're trying to do is accomplish a faster time to market. And the latter is definitely where most of the executives I talk to, is where they're focusing most of their attention is on the idea that they can build applications more quickly and spend less time maintaining them, and less about trying to save money by putting stuff in the public cloud.
Interesting. No, that's a really interesting take, and I'm glad you were able to kind of get that information out from those folks that you talked with. Moving on, because I know we only have a limited amount of time here. Duncan, I'd love to turn to you again with our next question. From a developer perspective or development perspective, what would you say is the most important element in developing a micro strategy?
So always, I like the, whatever that term is for it, but start small, baby steps, understand what you're doing. You got to understand the business problem. That's usually the hardest part. And then you have to be able to translate that into some type of actionable code that you're going to use. So doing that small and repetition in cycles. So some type of agile or whatever management style, Scrum or Kanban or whatever works. And sticking to that with code reviews, peer reviews, all that type of stuff. The standard practices many of us follow. It's often good to go back and relook at those practices and make sure that you're applying them right. I know historically, for example, with teams, it can take generally 4 to 5 months to develop a burn down rate, just because you're working on something new or you're working with new people or whatever. But once you get into that role, things start to move fairly quickly. If you think too large, you're going to get bogged down, and you keep refactoring and doing things over and over to make it perfect and all that, and you never end up delivering anything. So that's, I think, one of the key things is thinking small initially and then layering on top of it.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. And Clint, I'd love to pose the same question to you. What from your analysis and interviews, what did you see as the most important element in developing microservices strategy from an executive perspective?
Right. That same issue of starting small is the same. There's a lot of agreement there, fortunately. And just starting out with greenfield applications instead of trying to take all your legacy monolithic applications and just throw all those away and start fresh with microservices. You're never going to start if that's the goal, is to do it all at once. So starting with some new development and and building some confidence and competence in microservices that is really the way that the executives I spoke with would have preferred to proceed. And then once they have some microservices out there, then they could start swapping out functionality from legacy applications. So if there's some in email sending service that was previously built into a monolithic application that now they have a microservice that does that, they can swap that out instead of completely scrapping an existing application.
Interesting. No, it's great to see the consistency across, in terms of, being able to start small and build from there. I do think that's a good approach that companies are taking. Moving on, Duncan, I'd love to ask you this next question. From a developer perspective, how can companies resolve that configuration versus automation problem when migrating to a cloud-native infrastructure?
So I see this in two aspects. The first one is your CI/CD pipeline. The notion of that is relatively mature now. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that didn't exist. So everything was, you had a QA group that you'd push code to a quality assurance server, and then they would test it for, weeks or whatever. Generally, there was one or two people that were responsible for getting that stuff migrated out. Then you would port it to some hosting company that was maybe your DMZ servers and so forth. We don't do that anymore, right? We use GitLab or GitHub or Bitbucket or one of these types of setups, and we utilize them for Artifactory and for our source code and doing everything. They usually generally have scriptability that you can write scripts to push stuff out to wherever it needs to go, and the whole thing becomes automated. And it's based off of, or it should be based off of test coverage of the source code, making sure it compiles obviously and all the tests pass, etc. That can all be automated, and it's very efficient. When it comes to the dev side, it's like CI/CD or continuous integration and delivery was 15 years ago. We still have to set up everything locally on our laptops. We still have to pull down files and do all this kind of stuff. And I see some of the tools that what we're calling cloud native that they provide are going to give the ability of, hey, I got a new machine, I can sit down, I can log into my cloud environment, and within a matter of minutes, everything that I needed is completely set up for me already. Because I'm doing it in, I pull down a Docker image or I pull down a Kubernetes instance that has everything in it that I need, and I can go ahead and start coding right away. I think that's going to become more prevalent. You have things like Gitpod is what it's called, or Eclipse Chi, which is built on Microsoft, Visual Studio Code, and they have a lot of really powerful features built into them that include pipelines and all the different components that you need, rather than having to go figure them all out individually and install them locally. I think that's going to be one of the biggest benefits for us.
Interesting. No, that's really interesting to hear. And Clint, love to, I want to pose the same question to you, and from that executive perspective, how can companies resolve that configuration versus automation problem when migrating to a cloud native infrastructure?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is an area where we saw a lot of daylight between executives and developers, where developers in the survey response really wanted to maintain more control over their applications. So they wanted more configurable frameworks and solutions, whereas managers and executives, both in the survey and in my conversations, were a lot more bullish on the idea of migrating to SaaS services or APIs that from a developer's perspective might be sort of black boxes where they don't necessarily have much control or configurability. And I get that's the managers are wanting just automate this, get this off our plate, whereas I think developers are saying, well, wait, we don't necessarily want to fully sacrifice that control. So I think communication is really key here, in that executives really need to communicate their goals to their technical teams, and also listen and understand the concerns from the developers, and figure out where the happy medium lies. And that does require actually understanding the trade-offs between moving to systems that are more fully automated and that are maybe a little bit of a black box, versus having a lot of the burden of configuring and maintaining those services, and figuring out exactly what you really need to control, what you can let go of. It's just going to come down to a really honest communication between those teams, and an understanding of what the actual priorities are. I think the good news is that there's a growing range of solutions on the market. So the chances of finding that Goldilocks, just the right amount of configurability is increasing. That the odds of finding a service that has just the right knobs for you to turn is increasing as the number of options increase. So I mean that creates some choice paralysis maybe on the side of deciding what solution to go with, but it does at least make it a lot easier once you know what you need to find the right thing.
Yeah, no, that's definitely interesting. I do agree with you that communication was the one thing that we definitely saw in the survey, and I think that's still prevalent now as these new technologies emerge and become more ubiquitous, is being able to communicate between those different teams and being able to unite around a common strategy, but really just try to understand one another in a deeper capacity. Excellent. I thought now, again, those are great answers. I'd love to jump into some questions, because it looks like we do have a few here. And there's one I'd love to ask you both. It's something I was actually thinking about as well, especially as we start to move deeper into this world of cloud native. But and Duncan, let's start with you for this one. What do you think, at least from a developer perspective, what do you see in terms of adoption around serverless, service mesh, edge computing, some of these newer trends? Do you think they have legs? Do you think that is kind of the next step within the cloud native journey?
Yeah, I do. I think they are becoming more common. The challenge becomes you have a wide swath of languages that people like to use. Python, Scala, Java, Go, Rust, all these different languages, and they all have their benefits and their pitfalls. And to have an environment where you can essentially have cluster management and all these types of things all wrapped up in a nice box is very difficult to do. And then you may have some specifics to your industry or what you're trying to do. Maybe it's highly computational or what have you. So I think there are applications that folks will build that will fit very nicely into a serverless environment. And if that's the case, you look at it and see if it fits your needs, and then you use it by all means. But there are definitely applications that will not fit, or at least in the short term or the near future, are not going to fit in that environment because they need 10,000 nodes to run on or whatever. Granted, they may not be as common as some of the others, but they're out there. Like you're not going to run Gmail on a serverless environment. That's probably a bad example because it's so massive, but there are other ones that are not that massive that still, and I think of computational type systems. But I do think it's another tool in the toolbox, and it's a decent tool. And if it's the right tool for the job, then I would say use it.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's what I've been hearing as well out there in industry. One other question that we have that I love to get the panel's kind of take on, but Duncan, I think we can start with you. Education seems to be a major component of these new paradigms. And what do you see as kind of the major, again, roadblocks to folks being able to get up to speed with some of these newer technologies? And if you see any, and if you know of any potential solutions, what do you think those are?
People, those are the roadblocks. We are our own roadblocks. The new languages that are coming out aren't necessarily any harder, or the environment's any more difficult than stuff that we've dealt in the past. Go back and write some JCL on a mainframe, right? So it's really us. The individual developer or engineer has to make a decision about himself or herself and say, do I want to master this or do I not want to master it? A lot of people say it's the company's responsibility to train the employee. I disagree. I don't want to be bound like that. I want to train myself by taking courses, going to school, or whatever. You do whatever you need to do to acquire the skills. So I really believe the primary problem is ourselves, not the tooling, not the language or whatever. One can argue, oh, Scala is harder than Java or whatever. That may be so, but again, and then the team that the developers are part of, they need to assist each other and help each other do peer reviews and etc. Aside from that, there's all kinds of great knowledge on the internet. My gosh, I mean, it's like endless.
Yeah.
I mean, what developer does not Google when he gets an error? Google to see how the problem's solved.
Yeah.
Right. We used to have to subscribe and pay $100 a month to Dr. Dobbs' journal, but now it's all free. So
that's excellent. Yeah, no, those are great insights. It's one that I saw it come through as a question, and one that we saw in the survey when we asked folks. That was kind of one of the biggest things I think executives were concerned about. And I do think you're right, kind of being able to get developers. I think they're innately curious and will find solutions, but I think being able to kind of get them in the right mindset will be helpful, for this. But well, again, we're kind of winding towards the end of our time. It just about does it for today. As Clint and Duncan have shown, developers and executives will always have differing priorities based on their unique roles within the enterprise. The sooner you can align both parties around key business priorities, the more effectively you'll be able to implement new developer technologies. As a final note, check out Lightbend's 2-hour highly consultative executive workshop specifically for your organization. In this workshop, you'll uncover key opportunities to generate business value with cloud-native applications. This unique experience is interactive and custom built to uncover real opportunities for addressing business value at your company. You can learn more about this private workshop opportunity at the link provided in the chat window. And with that, again, I'd like to wrap up now. And again, thank Clint and Duncan. Thanks for joining the call. Really great to connect and have this discussion.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. And for everyone else on the call, thank you for being with us today. Please take care and stay safe.